They were already loading the rifle when Emma saw the horse through the kitchen window. The men stood in a loose circle near the paddock gate, their voices low and deliberate, the kind of tone people use when they've made a decision they don't want questioned. Her father was among them, hat pulled low, shoulders hunched against the morning drizzle that had been falling since dawn. The horse stood apart from the others, favoring its left foreleg, head lowered in a posture that spoke of exhaustion rather than submission. Even from this distance, Emma could see the gash along its shoulder, dark and wet against the chestnut coat. She knew what they were planning. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. In farming communities like Pinewood Valley, injured animals that couldn't work and couldn't heal became liabilities. Veterinary bills were luxuries when the bank was already circling. Sentiment was a privilege reserved for people who weren't 3 months behind on their mortgage. But Emma also knew something the men standing in that circle didn't. She had seen the way the horse looked north toward Cascade Ridge every time it lifted its head. She had noticed the leather anklet braided around its foreleg, worn and faded but deliberate in its craftsmanship. And she had felt, in a way she couldn't explain to anyone who hadn't experienced it themselves, that this horse had traveled a long distance for a reason that had nothing to do with accident or misfortune. The rifle gleamed dully in the gray light. Emma's hands tightened on the windowsill. She was 16 years old, small for her age, with her mother's dark hair and her father's stubborn jaw. She had learned young that in a house built on silence and survival, speaking up often cost more than staying quiet. But watching those men prepare to end a life because it was convenient, because it was practical, because it was easier than asking questions, she felt something crack open inside her chest. Before the rational part of her mind could list all the reasons why this was a terrible idea, Emma was moving. She grabbed her coat from the hook by the door and stepped out into the drizzle. The cold hit her face like a slap, but she kept walking, boots squelching in the mud, her breath coming fast and shallow. Her father looked up as she approached, his expression already hardening into the warning she knew well. "Emma, go back inside." His voice carried the weariness of a man who had run out of patience for arguments he knew he'd lose. She stopped a few feet from the group, positioning herself between them and the horse. The animal stirred at her presence, ears flicking forward, eyes wide but watchful. "I'm not letting you do this," she said. The words came out steadier than she felt. One of the men, a neighbor named Frank who helped during harvest season, shook his head slowly. "Girl, this isn't your call. That horse is lame. It's suffering. The kindest thing we can do is put it down quick." Emma's gaze didn't waver. "He's not suffering. He's exhausted. There's a difference." Her father stepped closer, voice dropping to the tone he used when he wanted to end a conversation without making a scene. "We don't have the money for a vet. We don't have the time to nurse an animal that isn't ours. Whoever lost him isn't coming back for him." She looked at the horse again. Its coat was matted with rain and dirt, ribs visible beneath the skin, but its eyes held a clarity that didn't match the narrative of a dying animal. This wasn't a creature giving up. This was a creature that had been pushed to its limits and was still standing. "Then I'll take care of him," Emma said. "I'll use my own money from the harvest work. I'll do the feeding, the cleaning, everything. You won't have to lift a finger." David Hartley removed his hat, running a hand through his graying hair. The gesture was familiar to Emma. It meant he was calculating costs, weighing risks, searching for the path of least resistance. "You don't understand what you're asking for. That's not a commitment you can keep." "I'm asking for 1 week," Emma said, her voice gaining strength. "Give me 1 week to prove he can recover. If he's not better by then, if he's still lame, if he's suffering, then you can make the call. But don't do this now. Not like this." The silence that followed was broken only by the patter of rain on the barn roof and the restless stamping of the other horses in the paddock. Frank exchanged a glance with the other men, then shrugged. "It's your place, David. Your call." Her father looked at his daughter, really looked at her, and something in his expression shifted. Emma rarely asked for anything. She carried herself with a quiet resilience that reminded him too much of his late wife, and perhaps that was why he found it so hard to deny her when she finally did speak up. 1 week, he said finally. But if that animal isn't sound by then, we're not having this conversation again. Emma felt the tension drain from her shoulders even as a new weight settled there. She nodded quickly, afraid he might change his mind if she gave him time to reconsider. Thank you. The men dispersed slowly, Frank clapping David on the shoulder before heading back toward his truck. Her father lingered, staring at the horse with an expression Emma couldn't quite read. Then he turned and walked back toward the house without another word. Emma approached the horse carefully, hands visible, movements slow and deliberate. The animal watched her with an intensity that felt almost human, as though it were evaluating her intentions the same way she was evaluating its condition. She could see now that the wound on its shoulder wasn't as deep as she'd feared, though it would need cleaning and careful attention. The lameness seemed to be from a stone bruise rather than structural damage, painful but potentially recoverable with rest. She reached out slowly, letting the horse catch her scent. Its nostrils flared, breath warm against her palm, and then it lowered its head slightly, a gesture of tentative acceptance. Up close, Emma could see the white blaze running down its face, a jagged lightning bolt of pale hair that gave the animal a striking, almost wild appearance. The braided leather anklet around its foreleg was definitely handmade, the kind of careful craftsmanship that spoke of affection rather than utility. This horse had been loved once. This horse had mattered to someone. Come on, she whispered, gathering the lead rope that still hung from its halter. Let's get you somewhere dry. The horse followed her into the barn with surprising willingness, its limp pronounced but not debilitating. Emma led it to an empty stall at the far end, away from the curious noses of the farm's other animals. She spread fresh straw, filled the water trough, and measured out a careful portion of grain, not too much for a system that might be shocked from days of poor nutrition. While the horse ate slowly, Emma fetched the first aid kit from the tack room and began the careful process of cleaning the shoulder wound. The animal flinched at the first touch of antiseptic but held still, as though it understood that she was trying to help. She worked methodically, the way her mother had taught her before the cancer had taken her 3 years ago. Gentle but thorough, talking softly the entire time to keep the animal calm. You came from somewhere, didn't you? Emma murmured as she wrapped the wound with clean gauze. You're trying to get back to someone. The horse's ear swiveled toward her voice, and for a moment, Emma could have sworn it understood. When she finished, she sat back on an overturned bucket, studying the animal in the dim light of the barn. Outside, the rain had intensified, drumming steadily on the roof. Through the open stall window, she could see the dark outline of Cascade Ridge rising against the gray sky. The horse turned its head in the same direction, body tensing as though pulled by an invisible thread. Emma felt a shiver run through her that had nothing to do with the cold. Whatever had brought this horse to their farm, whatever force had driven it through miles of rough country despite injury and exhaustion, it wasn't finished yet. And somehow, preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Impossibly, she had just convinced her father to give them both the time to find out what that purpose was. The barn became Emma's second home over the next 2 days. She woke before dawn, slipping out of the house while her father still slept, and spent the early hours mucking stalls, changing bandages, and coaxing the horse to eat with handfuls of sweet grain and sliced apples from the orchard. She had named him Amber, partly for the golden undertones in his chestnut coat, partly because amber was a stone that preserved things, held them safe across time. It felt appropriate for a horse that seemed to be carrying something precious across distance. The lameness improved faster than she'd dared hope. By the third morning, Amber was putting weight on the injured leg without flinching, and the wound on his shoulder had begun to close cleanly. Emma felt a surge of vindication each time she watched him move around the stall with increasing confidence. She had been right. He hadn't needed death. He had needed time. But even as his body healed, his behavior remained strange. He barely touched the hay she brought, eating only enough to sustain himself. He never relaxed into the drowsy contentment that characterized the other horses. Instead, He stood at the stall window for hours, gazing north with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Emma tried to understand it, spending her own hours watching him, trying to decode the language of his restlessness. On the fourth day, she brought her sketchbook to the barn, settling onto a hay bale while Amber maintained his vigil at the window. She had always drawn as a way of thinking, her hands working out problems her mind couldn't quite articulate. As her pencil moved across the page, capturing the arch of Amber's neck and the peculiar stillness of his posture, she found herself thinking about the braided anklet. Someone had made that with care. Someone had marked this horse as special, as safe, as meant for a particular purpose. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of tires on gravel. Emma glanced through the barn door and saw a dusty green pickup truck pulling into the yard. The driver who emerged was a woman in her late 30s, dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing a weathered canvas jacket that marked her as someone who spent more time with animals than people. Emma recognized her immediately. Grace Mitchell, the veterinarian who kept a small practice in Riverside and made calls to the Valley farms when emergencies demanded it. Emma's father appeared from the equipment shed, wiping his hands on a rag as he walked over to meet Grace. Their conversation was too quiet for Emma to hear from this distance, but she saw her father gesture toward the barn, and her stomach tightened. He had called the vet. Despite his promise to give her a week, he had called in a professional opinion, probably hoping Grace would confirm that putting the horse down was the reasonable choice. Emma stood quickly, brushing hay from her jeans as Grace headed toward the barn. The vet's expression was neutral, professional, giving nothing away. She nodded to Emma as she entered, her gaze immediately finding Amber in his stall. "Your dad mentioned you'd taken in a stray," Grace said, her tone conversational rather than judgmental. "Mind if I take a look?" Emma stepped aside, though every instinct told her to position herself between the vet and the horse. Grace approached the stall with the practiced calm of someone who had examined thousands of animals, speaking in low, soothing tones as she let Amber catch her scent. The horse regarded her warily but didn't retreat. Grace opened the stall door and entered slowly, hands visible, movements telegraphed well in advance. She ran her hands along Amber's neck, down his legs, checking joints and tendons with methodical precision. She examined the shoulder wound, nodding slightly at the clean bandaging. Then she lifted the injured hoof, studying it carefully before setting it down gently. The entire examination took perhaps 10 minutes, but to Emma, it felt like an hour. Finally, Grace stepped out of the stall and turned to face her. "You've done good work here. The wound is healing well, and the stone bruise is resolving. With another few days of rest, he should be sound." Emma felt relief wash over her, so intense it made her knees weak. "So he's going to be okay?" Grace's expression remained thoughtful. "Physically, yes. But there's something else you should know." She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small flashlight, gesturing for Emma to follow her back into the stall. "See this?" Grace lifted Amber's lip carefully, revealing his teeth and gums. She shone the light along his gum line, then moved to examine the inside of his ear. "These are tattoo marks. Very faded, probably 10 years old or more. But they're there. This horse was registered at some point, probably in a therapy program." Emma's breath caught. "A therapy program?" Grace nodded, moving her examination to Amber's legs. "And this anklet, it's not decorative. This is a marker. I've seen them before, years ago, when I volunteered at a program run by a woman named Helen Porter. She braided these herself for horses she trained to work with traumatized kids, mostly from the foster system. The leather had a specific pattern, 3 strands with a copper bead at the center. See? She indicated the anklet, and sure enough, Emma could make out the faint glint of tarnished copper beneath the grime. Emma's mind raced. Helen Porter. The name stirred something in her memory, a conversation overheard years ago between her parents, something about a woman who had lived up in the mountains and ran some kind of camp until funding dried up. "You think he came from her program?" Emma asked. Grace straightened, brushing dust from her hands. "I think he did once upon a time, but that program shut down almost a decade ago. Helen lost her funding, and from what I heard, She sold off most of her horses and disappeared into the hills. People assumed she'd moved away or passed on. Nobody's seen her in years. Then where did he come from? How did he end up here? Those are excellent questions, Grace said quietly. She studied Amber again, watching the way he positioned himself at the window, the tension in his muscles. I'll tell you something else. Horses don't behave like this without reason. That fixation on the mountains, the way he won't settle, it's like he's trying to complete a journey. Emma felt vindication surge through her again. Stronger this time. I knew it. I told my dad he was trying to get somewhere. Grace's expression shifted, becoming more serious. Emma, if this horse did come from Helen Porter's program, and if he's trying to get back to her, there's something you need to understand. Those mountains are dangerous this time of year. Early snows, rough terrain, predators. And if Helen is still up there, she's been alone for a very long time. If she needed help, if that's why this horse traveled all this way, then the situation is probably dire. The weight of those words settled over Emma like a physical thing. She looked at Amber, at the determination in every line of his body, and felt the edges of a decision forming in her mind. What are you saying? I'm saying that if you're thinking about following this horse to wherever he's trying to go, you need to be prepared for what you might find. Grace reached out and placed a hand on Emma's shoulder. And you need to tell your father. This isn't something you can do alone. Emma nodded slowly, though part of her was already calculating how she might do exactly that if her father refused. Grace seemed to read the thought in her face because she squeezed Emma's shoulder gently. I mean it, Emma. These mountains don't forgive mistakes. Promise me you'll talk to him first. I promise, Emma said, and meant it. Even as she wondered whether her father would listen to anything that involved risk, uncertainty, or venturing beyond the boundaries of their struggling farm. After Grace left, Emma stood in the barn doorway, watching the vet's truck disappear down the long gravel drive. The afternoon light was fading, casting long shadows across the apple orchard, where unpicked fruit still hung heavy on the branches. Her father would be in soon, expecting dinner, expecting normalcy, expecting his daughter to accept the narrow confines of their life without complaint. Instead, Emma walked back to Amber's stall and looked into the horse's dark, knowing eyes. We're going to find her, she said quietly. Whoever you're looking for, whatever you're trying to finish, we're going to see it through. Amber lowered his head, and for the first time since arriving, seemed to relax slightly, as though he understood that he had finally found an ally who wouldn't dismiss the urgency of his mission. Outside, the first stars were beginning to appear over Cascade Ridge, cold and distant and impossibly clear. Emma wrapped her coat tighter and headed back toward the house, her mind already working through how to convince a man who had spent the last 3 years avoiding risk of any kind that his daughter needed to follow an injured horse into the wilderness to find a woman who might not even be alive. It was, she reflected grimly, going to be a difficult conversation. Dinner that evening was a silent affair, as most meals had been in the Hartley household since Emma's mother passed. David pushed food around his plate without much interest, his mind clearly elsewhere, probably calculating yield projections for the apple harvest or reviewing bank statements that never seemed to balance. Emma watched him across the table, searching for an opening, a moment when his defenses might be low enough to hear what she needed to say. The kitchen was warm despite the chill outside, the old wood stove radiating heat that made the windows fog at the edges. Emma's grandmother had cooked at this same stove, and her great-grandmother before that. The house itself was over a century old, built by Hartleys who had claimed this land when Oregon was still raw territory. That history sat heavy in every room, a reminder of legacy and obligation that her father carried like a yoke. Grace Mitchell came by today, Emma said finally, breaking the silence. David looked up, fork pausing halfway to his mouth. His expression was guarded. I know, called her. Emma felt a flash of irritation but pushed it down. She said Amber's going to be fine. The wound is healing clean, and the lameness is almost gone. Her father set down his fork carefully. That's good. I'm glad you were right about giving him time. The acknowledgement surprised her. David Hartley didn't admit being wrong easily, didn't hand out validation like it was something freely given. Emma seized the opening before he could retreat back into silence. She also said something else. about where he might have come from. David's eyes narrowed slightly, that familiar wariness creeping back. Emma pressed forward, explaining what Grace had told her about the therapy program, about Helen Porter, about the braided anklet and the way Amber kept staring north like he was navigating by an internal compass that wouldn't let him rest. Her father listened without interrupting, but Emma could see the resistance building in the set of his jaw, the way his shoulders pulled back as though bracing against an impact. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, the only sound the ticking of the old clock on the wall. "So what are you asking me?" he said finally. Emma took a breath. "I want to follow him. I want to see where he's trying to go. If Helen Porter is still up there, if she needs help, we might be the only people who know." David stood abruptly, carrying his plate to the sink with more force than necessary. The clatter of dishes filled the pause before he spoke. "Absolutely not. Dad, listen to me." Emma rose as well, refusing to let him end the conversation by walking away. This horse traveled miles through rough country with an injured leg. He didn't do that randomly. He's trying to get back to someone, and that someone might be in trouble. "You don't know that," David said, his back still to her. "You're making up a story because you've gotten attached to a stray animal. That's not reason enough to go wandering into the mountains with winter coming on." Grace said she recognized the markers. She's seen Helen's work before. "This isn't me making things up." David turned to face her, and Emma saw something in his expression that went beyond simple refusal. It was fear, raw and unguarded for just a moment before he shut it down. "Those mountains are dangerous, Emma. People get lost up there. People die up there." The unspoken name hung between them. Thomas, David's younger brother, Emma's uncle, who had died when Emma was barely old enough to remember him. She knew the story in fragments, pieced together from overheard conversations and the weight of silence that descended whenever anyone mentioned his name. There had been a storm, a barn collapse, horses trapped inside. Thomas had gone in to free them while David ran for help. By the time he returned, the entire structure had come down. They'd found Thomas beneath the rubble, crushed while trying to save animals that had already panicked beyond saving. Emma's voice softened. "I know you're scared. I know what happened to Uncle Thomas still hurts. But this is different. Is it?" David's voice was hard now, armor back in place. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like my daughter wanting to risk her life for an animal she barely knows. Heading into country that could kill her a dozen different ways. Chasing a woman who's probably been dead for years. That sounds pretty similar to me. What if she's not dead? What if she's up there alone and hurt and this horse is the only connection she has to the world? We can't just ignore that." David's laugh was bitter. "We can't save everyone, Emma. The sooner you learn that, the better off you'll be." The words landed like a slap. Emma felt tears prick her eyes but refused to let them fall. "So that's it? We just let Amber suffer because he can't finish what he started? We just pretend we don't know someone might need help?" "I didn't say that." David's voice was quieter now, tired. "I said you're not going up into those mountains. If you want to call the ranger station, report a possible person in distress, that's fine. Let the professionals handle it. And when they ask for evidence, when they want to know why we think someone's up there, what do I tell them? That a horse has been staring at the ridgeline?" Her father had no answer for that. They both knew how it would sound, how quickly it would be dismissed as the fancy of an imaginative teenager with too much time on her hands. Emma changed tactics, trying to find a foothold in his logic. "Give me 3 days. That's all I'm asking. Grace said she'd come with me if you agreed. We take supplies, tell Ranger Cooper exactly where we're going, check in regularly. 3 days to follow Amber's trail and see if we can find anything. If we don't find evidence of Helen Porter by then, we turn around and come home." David was already shaking his head. "You're supposed to be helping with the harvest. We're behind as it is, and every apple that drops because we didn't have hands to pick it is money we can't afford to lose. I've picked more apples this season than anyone else on this farm." Emma shot back. "I'm not asking for a vacation. I'm asking for a chance to do something that matters beyond yield projections and bank payments." The harshness of her tone seemed to surprise them both. David looked at his daughter as though seeing her clearly for the first time in months. taking in the steel in her spine, the determination in her eyes that mirrored his own stubbornness thrown back at him. 3 days, Emma repeated, more gently this time. Please. Her father turned away, staring out the kitchen window toward the dark shape of the mountains barely visible against the night sky. When he spoke again, his voice was so low she almost didn't hear it. Your mother would have wanted you to go. The statement caught Emma off guard. David rarely spoke about his late wife, as though saying her name aloud would somehow make the loss more real, more permanent. She always believed in following through, he continued, in seeing things to their end, even when it was hard. Especially when it was hard. He paused, shoulders sagging slightly. I'm not like her. I'm not brave enough to risk what matters most on a maybe. Emma crossed the kitchen and stood beside him, looking out at the same darkness. You're braver than you think, Dad. You've kept this farm going for 3 years with no help and no hope. That takes courage too. David didn't respond immediately. The clock ticked. The stove crackled. Outside, wind moved through the apple trees with a sound like distant water. Finally, he spoke. 3 days. You take Grace with you, you check in every 12 hours, and you carry the emergency beacon. The first sign of weather turning, the first moment you feel unsafe, you come home immediately. No arguments, no negotiations. Emma felt relief flood through her. So intense it made her dizzy. Promise. Thank you. Her father nodded once, still not looking at her. And Emma? His voice caught slightly. Come back safe. I can't lose you too. She reached out and squeezed his hand, feeling the calluses earned from decades of farm work, the strength that remained despite everything life had taken from him. I will. I promise I will. That night, Emma lay awake in her childhood bedroom, staring at the ceiling where glow-in-the-dark stars still clung from when she was 8 years old. Her mother had helped her put them up, standing on a rickety chair while Emma called out constellations from a library book. The memory was clear and sharp, one of thousands that kept her mother alive in her mind even as the years stretched the distance between past and present. She thought about what her father had said, about her mother believing in following through. It was true. Margaret Hartley had been a woman of fierce conviction, the kind of person who volunteered at the food bank even when their own cupboards were sparse, who took in foster children despite having barely enough resources for their own family. She had believed in showing up, in doing the work that needed doing simply because it needed doing. Emma wondered what her mother would think of this plan, of following a mysterious horse into the wilderness on nothing but intuition and hope. She liked to think Margaret would approve, would see it as the kind of purposeful risk worth taking. But she also knew her mother would have insisted on proper preparation, on thinking through every contingency, on making sure emotion didn't override common sense. With that in mind, Emma got up and turned on her desk lamp, pulling out a notebook and beginning to make lists. Supplies they would need, routes they might take, emergency protocols if something went wrong. She worked through the details methodically, her mind finding calm in the practical work of planning. By the time exhaustion finally pulled her toward sleep, she had filled 6 pages with careful handwriting, each item checked and double-checked, each scenario considered and addressed. She fell asleep with the notebook open beside her, one hand still resting on the page as though holding onto the promise of what tomorrow might bring. The next morning arrived cold and clear, the kind of autumn day that made the world feel sharp-edged and full of possibility. Emma was up before dawn again, pulling on layers against the chill and heading out to the barn. Amber greeted her with a low nicker, the first sound she'd heard him make beyond the occasional snort or sigh. His eyes were bright, the dullness of exhaustion finally lifting. She checked his leg carefully, running her hands along the tendons and joints, feeling for heat or swelling. Everything seemed sound. The wound on his shoulder was scabbing over cleanly, no sign of infection. She changed the bandage one more time, then stepped back to assess him fully. You're almost ready, aren't you? She murmured. Just need another day or 2 of rest, and then we'll see where you've been trying to go. Amber stamped once, as though in agreement, then returned his attention to the window and the mountains beyond. Emma smiled despite herself, feeling the nervous anticipation that came with standing on the edge of something unknown. Grace Mitchell arrived mid-morning, pulling up in her truck with a load of supplies in the bed. Emma helped her unload saddlebags, camping gear, medical kits both human and animal, and enough food for a week even though they were only planning on 3 days. Grace believed in over-preparation, a philosophy Emma appreciated. "Your dad called me last night," Grace said as they organized equipment in the barn. Sounded like he'd aged about 10 years in the conversation. "He's worried." "I know." Emma folded a tarp carefully, pressing out the air pockets. "But he said yes. That's what matters." Grace studied her for a moment. "You understand what we might find up there, right? Best case scenario, we locate Helen Porter alive and well, and this horse gets a happy reunion. Worst case, we find a body that's been decomposing for years, or we don't find anything at all and we've wasted 3 days chasing a fantasy." Emma met her gaze steadily. "I understand. But I also understand that if we don't try, we'll never know. And Amber will spend the rest of his life trying to finish a journey he can't complete on his own. That doesn't seem right." Grace's expression softened. "You remind me of your mother. She had that same stubborn idealism, that belief that the world could be better if people just tried harder." "Is that a compliment?" "Yes," Grace said simply, "though it's also a warning. Idealism without pragmatism gets people hurt. You need both to survive what we're about to attempt." They spent the rest of the day preparing, checking and rechecking equipment, reviewing maps of the mountain trails, discussing the route they would most likely take. Grace had connections at the ranger station and had already filed their itinerary with Ranger Cooper, who had expressed reservations but agreed to monitor their check-ins. Emma also spent time with Amber, leading him around the paddock in slow circles, letting him stretch his legs and build back the muscle that had atrophied during his journey. He moved better each hour, the limp fading to barely noticeable. She could feel his eagerness building, the way he pulled slightly toward the gate that faced north, ready to resume the mission that had driven him this far. That evening, the Hartley family ate dinner together again, though this time Emma's father had invited Grace to join them. The conversation was careful, circling around the upcoming trip without addressing it directly, as though speaking the plan aloud might somehow jinx it. But as they were clearing plates, David pulled out a folded piece of paper from his shirt pocket and slid it across the table to Emma. She unfolded it carefully, recognizing her great-grandfather's handwriting, the same careful script she'd seen in old farm ledgers stored in the attic. It was a hand-drawn map of the valley and the surrounding mountains, dated 1947, showing trails and landmarks that predated any official survey. In the upper right corner, near a ridge marked Cascade Peak, someone had drawn a small cabin and written beside it, HP. Eastern Meadow, Blue Door. Emma's breath caught. "Where did you find this?" "In your great-grandfather's papers," David said. "I remembered it after you left yesterday. He used to trap up in those mountains during the Depression, knew every trail and hollow. Helen Porter's family owned land up there, though they sold most of it off before she was born. That cabin was originally a trapping shelter, but the Porters maintained it even after the land changed hands. If she's anywhere, that's where she'd be." "This is perfect," Emma breathed, studying the map closely. Grace leaned over her shoulder, tracing the route with one finger. "It's a hard 2-day ride from here, maybe longer if the trails are overgrown. But it's doable if the weather holds." David nodded slowly. "The forecast is clear for the next 4 days. After that, there's a system moving in from the coast could bring early snow. You need to be off the mountain before that arrives." "We will be," Emma promised, folding the map carefully and tucking it into her jacket pocket. "Thank you, Dad. This helps more than you know." Her father's expression was complicated, worry and pride tangled together. "Just remember what I said. The first sign of trouble, you come home. Nothing up there is worth your life." Emma wanted to argue that Helen Porter's life might be worth the risk, that finishing what Amber had started mattered beyond personal safety. But she read the fear in her father's eyes and held her tongue. Some arguments weren't worth winning if they cost you the peace of the people you loved. Instead, she simply nodded and helped finish clearing the table, moving through the familiar rhythms of evening chores with a focus that belied the electric anticipation humming beneath her skin. Tomorrow they would leave. Tomorrow they would follow Amber into the mountains and discover whatever truth waited at the end of his journey. Tonight, she would sleep in her childhood bed one more time, surrounded by the safety of walls and warmth and family, storing up comfort against the unknown days ahead. As Emma climbed the stairs to her room that night, she paused at the landing where a photograph hung of her mother and uncle together, both young and laughing, standing beside a horse Emma didn't recognize. Her mother's hand rested on Thomas's shoulder, and his head was thrown back in uninhibited joy. They looked invincible in that moment, untouched by the tragedies that would later define them in absence. Emma touched the glass lightly, a silent promise forming in her mind. She would come back. She would see this through and return safely, because the people in this house had already lost too much to grief, and she refused to add her name to that list. But she would also not turn away from what needed doing. That balance between caution and courage, between pragmatism and idealism, would be the tightrope she'd have to walk in the days ahead. She went to bed with the map under her pillow and Amber's determined gaze fixed in her memory, knowing that tomorrow everything would change, one way or another. The morning of departure arrived with a pink-stained sky that promised fair weather. Emma was awake before the alarm, dressed and downstairs before her father had even started the coffee. She moved through the kitchen with quiet efficiency, packing food into containers, filling thermoses, double-checking that she had everything on her carefully prepared lists. David appeared in the doorway as she was shouldering her backpack, testing its weight. He held out a small device that Emma recognized as the satellite emergency beacon, the kind that could signal for rescue anywhere in the world with the press of a button. "Batteries fully charged," he said. "Keep it in your jacket pocket, not the pack. If something happens and you get separated from your gear, you'll still have it." Emma took the beacon, feeling the weight of his trust in the small piece of technology. "I'll be careful. I know you will." He pulled her into an unexpected hug, brief but fierce. "Your mother would be proud of you." The words threatened to undo Emma's composure, but she held steady, returning the embrace before stepping back. "I'll call in at noon and midnight just like we planned." David nodded, not quite meeting her eyes. "Grace is already at the barn, getting the horses ready." She brought her own mount and borrowed one from the Sanders place for pack supplies. Emma started toward the door, then paused. "Dad, when I get back, let's have a real conversation about the farm. About what we're going to do, how we're going to keep it. No more avoiding the hard discussions." Her father's expression flickered with something that might have been relief. "All right, when you get back, we'll talk." It was a promise and a deadline all at once. Emma carried it with her out into the cold morning, toward the barn where Grace was indeed saddling horses with practiced efficiency. Amber stood ready beside them, a simple halter and lead rope all he'd need, since Emma had no intention of riding him until she was certain his leg could handle the weight. Grace looked up as Emma approached, assessing her with a practiced eye. "You ready for this?" "As ready as I'll ever be." "Then let's not waste daylight." Grace swung into her saddle with the ease of someone who'd spent more of her life on horseback than off. Emma mounted the borrowed pack horse, a steady gray mare named Willow who had a reputation for unflappable calm, even in difficult situations. Amber needed no leading. The moment they turned toward the trail that headed north, he moved forward with purpose, his limp now barely perceptible, his entire body radiating eagerness. Emma kept the lead rope loose, letting him set the pace, trusting that he knew the way better than any map could show them. They left the farm behind as the sun cleared the horizon, painting the apple orchards in shades of gold and amber. Emma looked back once, seeing her father's silhouette in the doorway, one hand raised in farewell. Then they entered the tree line, and the familiar world fell away behind them, replaced by the ancient quiet of the forest. The trail was narrow but well-worn, used by hunters and hikers during better weather. It climbed steadily through stands of Douglas fir and western red cedar, the air growing cooler and thinner as they gained elevation. Amber moved with confidence, never hesitating at forks in the path, always choosing the route that led higher and deeper into the mountains. Grace rode beside Emma when the trail allowed, their conversation sporadic and practical. They discussed water sources, camping spots, signs of wildlife to watch for. But mostly they rode in companionable silence, both women lost in their own thoughts as the miles accumulated beneath them. By midday, they had climbed high enough that the valley below was visible in glimpses through the trees, the farm reduced to toy-sized buildings amid a patchwork of fields. Emma pulled out the satellite phone her father had insisted she carry and made her first check-in call. His relief at hearing her voice was palpable even through the static-filled connection. "Everything's fine," she assured him. "Clear weather, good trail, no problems. Amber knows exactly where he's going." After she hung up, Grace glanced over with a slight smile. "He's gonna drive himself crazy until you get back." "I know, but at least he let me go. That counts for something." They pushed on through the afternoon, following Amber's unwavering path north and east, climbing toward the higher elevations where the map showed Helen Porter's cabin should be. The landscape changed as they ascended, the thick forest giving way to more open terrain dotted with alpine meadows and stands of aspen whose leaves had already turned a brilliant gold. The beauty of it caught Emma's breath more than once, made her understand why someone might choose this isolation over the complications of valley life. But she also saw the harshness beneath the beauty, the way the terrain could kill with casual indifference, the remoteness that would turn any injury or illness into a potential death sentence. As evening approached, they reached a clearing beside a swift-running creek, and Grace called a halt. "We'll camp here tonight. That meadow ahead is exposed, and the temperature's going to drop hard after sunset. Better to have tree cover." They worked together to set up camp with the efficient choreography of people who knew what they were doing. Grace handled the horses while Emma gathered firewood and set up the tent. Within an hour, they had a small fire burning, coffee brewing, and freeze-dried meals rehydrating in their pouches. Amber drank deeply from the creek but showed no interest in grazing like the other horses. Instead, he stood at the edge of camp, staring into the gathering darkness toward the ridgeline that loomed above them, still miles away but closer now than when they'd started. Emma sat beside the fire, studying her great-grandfather's map in the flickering light. According to the landmarks they'd passed, they were perhaps halfway to the cabin's location. Tomorrow would be harder terrain, steeper climbs, more exposure to weather and wildlife. But they were on track, and Amber's certainty had never wavered. Grace joined her, 2 cups of coffee in hand. She passed one to Emma and studied the map over her shoulder. "If we make good time tomorrow, we could reach that eastern meadow by late afternoon. Then it's just a matter of finding the cabin." "If it's still there," Emma said. "That map is almost 80 years old." "True. But structures built to withstand this environment don't fall apart easily. If the cabin was solid when your great-grandfather drew this, chances are good it's solid now." They sat in comfortable silence, drinking coffee and watching sparks rise from the fire into the vast darkness above. The stars here were overwhelming, thousands upon thousands visible without the light pollution of the valley. Emma picked out constellations her mother had taught her, finding comfort in the familiar patterns. Grace broke the quiet eventually, her voice thoughtful. "Can I ask you something? Why does this matter so much to you? I understand wanting to help, but you're risking a lot on what might be nothing." Emma considered the question carefully. She could give the easy answer about not being able to ignore someone in need, about seeing a task through to completion. But Grace deserved more honesty than that. "When my mom died, I felt like our family just shut down. Dad stopped talking about anything that mattered. I stopped asking questions that might hurt. We existed in the same house but not really together, just 2 people moving around each other in careful patterns." She stared into the fire, watching the flames dance. "This horse shows up, and he's got this mission he won't quit no matter how hurt or tired he is. He knows what he needs to do, and he's willing to walk through pain to finish it. That feels like something worth honoring. Like if I can help him complete what he started, maybe it proves that broken things can still be whole enough to matter." Grace was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached over and squeezed Emma's shoulder gently. "Your mom would be proud of you. Not because you're chasing after a horse, but because you're choosing to care when it would be easier not to." The words settled into Emma like warmth, loosening something tight in her chest. They finished their coffee in silence, then banked the fire and retreated to the tent, leaving Amber standing sentinel in the darkness, still watching north, still waiting for whatever tomorrow would bring them closer to discovering. Emma's last thought before sleep claimed her was that tomorrow, One way or another, they would find answers. The journey Amber had started so many miles ago was finally approaching its end, and she would be there to witness whatever truth waited in those mountains. Whatever purpose had driven him through exhaustion and injury to lead strangers into the wilderness. She slept deeply, dreamlessly, her body surrendering to exhaustion while her mind prepared for whatever the next day would demand of her courage, her conviction, and her willingness to see difficult things through to their conclusion. Dawn broke cold and crystalline, the temperature having dropped well below freezing during the night. Emma woke to find frost coating the outside of the tent, her breath visible in white puffs even inside her sleeping bag. She dressed quickly in layers, fingers clumsy with cold, and emerged to find Grace already breaking down camp with methodical efficiency. "Coffee's hot," Grace said without looking up from rolling her sleeping bag. "Drink fast. We need to cover ground before the sun gets high enough to melt the trail into mud." Emma poured coffee into her metal cup, wrapping both hands around it for warmth. The horses stood in a tight cluster near the creek, their breath creating a collective fog in the morning air. All except Amber, who stood apart as always, facing the ridgeline with an intensity that seemed to have sharpened overnight. After a quick breakfast of granola bars and dried fruit, they saddled up and continued north. The trail grew steeper almost immediately, switching back and forth across the mountainside in a series of tight turns that required careful navigation. Loose scree made footing treacherous, and more than once Emma felt Willow slip slightly before regaining purchase. Amber moved with surprising agility despite his recent injury, picking his way across difficult terrain with the confidence of an animal that had made this journey before, perhaps many times. Emma found herself trusting his choices, following his path even when it seemed to diverge from the trail marked on the map. By mid-morning, they had climbed above the tree line into open alpine country. The view stretched for miles in every direction, mountain peaks marching away into blue distance, valleys filled with morning mist that looked like lakes of cloud. It was breathtaking and terrifying in equal measure, the sheer scale of wilderness making Emma acutely aware of how small they were, how vulnerable. They stopped briefly to rest the horses and check their position. Grace pulled out a compass and GPS unit, cross-referencing their coordinates with the old map. "According to this, we're about 3 miles from where your great-grandfather marked the cabin. But the terrain between here and there is rough. Probably another 4 hours of riding, maybe more." Emma nodded, chewing on an energy bar without really tasting it. Her legs ached from the long hours in the saddle, and her shoulders burned from the weight of her pack. But Amber showed no signs of slowing, and she refused to be the weak link that forced them to stop. They pressed on, the sun climbing higher but providing little warmth at this elevation. The wind picked up as they traversed an exposed ridge, cutting through Emma's layers with icy fingers. She hunched lower in the saddle, focusing on the steady rhythm of Willow's gait, counting steps to keep her mind occupied. It was Grace who spotted the first sign that they were on the right track. She reined in suddenly, pointing to a series of wooden posts driven into the ground along the trail's edge. "These are old fence posts. Someone maintained a boundary line here at some point." They followed the posts north, and soon other evidence of human presence began to appear. A collapsed lean-to shelter, its roof caved in but the basic structure still recognizable. A rusted metal bucket hanging from a tree branch. Most significantly, a narrow side trail that branched off from the main path, so overgrown it would have been easy to miss if they hadn't been looking for it. Amber turned onto this side trail without hesitation, pushing through brush that hadn't been cleared in years. Emma and Grace exchanged glances but followed, trusting the horses' navigation even as branches scraped against their legs and caught in the horses' manes. The trail descended slightly into a protected bowl of land ringed by rock formations that blocked the worst of the wind. And there, nestled against the eastern edge of the bowl where a spring fed a small pool of clear water, stood a cabin. It was smaller than Emma had imagined, a single-room structure built from hand-hewn logs that had weathered to silver gray. The roof sagged in the middle but appeared mostly intact, and the door still hung on its hinges. Most striking was the door itself, painted a faded blue that stood out against the neutral tones of wood and stone surrounding it. Emma's heart hammered in her chest. "Grace, look, I see it." Grace's voice was tight with controlled excitement. That's the place. Has to be. They approached slowly, wary of what they might find. Smoke rose from a metal chimney pipe, thin but visible, proof that someone had built a fire recently. Very recently. Amber broke into a trot, pulling ahead despite Emma's attempt to slow him. He went straight to the cabin door and began pawing at the ground, whinnying loudly in a way Emma had never heard from him before. It wasn't distress. It was announcement, declaration, the sound of an animal calling out to someone they recognized. Grace dismounted first, her hand instinctively moving to the knife sheathed at her belt. She approached the door cautiously, Emma close behind, while Amber continued his insistent pawing and calling. "Hello?" Grace called out. "Is anyone here? We mean no harm. We're looking for Helen Porter." Silence answered them, broken only by the wind and Amber's restless movements. Grace reached for the door handle, then paused, looking back at Emma. "You ready for whatever's on the other side of this?" Emma nodded, though ready felt like an inadequate word for the mix of anticipation and dread churning in her stomach. Grace pushed the door open slowly. The hinges protested with a rusty squeal, and then they were looking into the dim interior of the cabin. The space was indeed single room, maybe 15 feet square, with a small wood stove in one corner still radiating heat from banked coals. A narrow cot occupied another corner, piled with worn blankets and what looked like an old sleeping bag patched with duct tape. Shelves lined one wall, holding jars of preserved food, boxes of matches, candles, a few battered books. The air smelled of wood smoke and age and something else Emma couldn't quite identify, something medicinal and sharp. And in a wooden rocking chair near the stove, wrapped in layers of clothing that made it difficult to tell where fabric ended and person began, sat an elderly woman. Her eyes were closed, her breathing shallow but regular, and her face held the kind of deep lines that spoke of decades spent outdoors in harsh weather. Her hair was white and thin, pulled back in a loose braid, and her hands rested in her lap with the stillness of exhaustion. Grace moved forward quickly, her medical training overriding everything else. She knelt beside the chair, pressing 2 fingers to the woman's neck to check her pulse. Emma held her breath, waiting. "She's alive," Grace said after a moment. "Pulse is weak but steady. She's severely dehydrated and malnourished, probably hypothermic. We need to warm her up and get fluids into her." "Is it her? Is it Helen?" Grace gently lifted one of the woman's hands, examining it in the light filtering through the cabin's single grimy window. "I can't be certain, but look at this." She indicated the woman's fingers, which were scarred and calloused in a distinctive pattern. "These are rope burns, old ones. The kind you get from working with horses for years, from braiding leather and handling lead lines. Combined with her age and location, I'd say the odds are very good this is Helen Porter." Emma felt a surge of emotion so strong it brought tears to her eyes. They had found her. Against all probability, following nothing but a horse's determination and an old map, they had actually found her. Amber appeared in the doorway, filling the small space with his presence. The woman's eyes fluttered open at the sound of his hooves on the wooden floor. For a moment, she seemed confused, disoriented. Then her gaze focused on the horse, and her expression transformed completely. "Scout," she whispered, her voice cracked and barely audible. "You came back." Amber moved forward, lowering his head until his muzzle touched the woman's outstretched hand. She began to cry silently, tears tracking down her weathered face as she stroked his nose with trembling fingers. "I thought I'd lost you forever," she continued, speaking to the horse as though no one else existed. "They took you away. They took all of you away. But you came back. My brave boy came back." Grace looked at Emma, her own eyes glistening. She cleared her throat gently. "Ma'am, my name is Grace Mitchell. I'm a veterinarian from Riverside. This is Emma Hartley. We followed your horse here. Can you tell us your name?" The woman's attention shifted slowly to them, as though registering their presence for the first time. "Helen," she said after a long pause. "Helen Porter. Though I suppose that name doesn't mean much anymore." "It means something to us," Emma said, kneeling on the woman's other side. "Your horse, Scout, He showed up at our farm injured but determined to get somewhere. We followed him here. How long have you been alone? Helen's eyes drifted, unfocused. Time doesn't work the same way up here. Days blur together. The cabin keeps me alive, but just barely. I ran out of most supplies weeks ago. Maybe longer. She looked at Scout again. I kept hoping he'd find his way back. Kept hoping someone would remember. Remember what? Grace asked gently. That we existed. That the work we did mattered. Helen's hand continued stroking Scout's face with a kind of desperate tenderness. I had 17 children that last summer. 17 kids nobody else wanted, nobody else could reach. The horses reached them. Scout especially. He could calm the most traumatized child, could make them feel safe when nothing else could. What happened to the program? Emma asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Money, Helen said bitterly. Always money. The state cut funding. Private donors moved on to newer causes. The board voted to sell the land, liquidate the horses, close everything down. They said the program wasn't cost-effective, wasn't sustainable. As if healing broken children could be measured in quarterly returns. Where did Scout go when they sold the horses? Helen's expression clouded. A man bought 6 of my horses, said he ran a trail riding operation down near the valley. Seemed legitimate enough. Papers were in order. She paused, pain crossing her face. I found out later he was a kill buyer. Lied about everything. By the time I discovered the truth, the horses were gone. I tried to find them, tried to buy them back, but he'd already moved them out of state. Grace's jaw tightened. That happens more often than people realize. The horse trade has a dark underbelly. I couldn't live with what I'd let happen, Helen continued. Couldn't face going back to regular life knowing those horses had trusted me and I'd failed them. So I came up here to the cabin my grandfather built. Thought I'd just disappear. Let the world forget about Helen Porter and her failed dreams. Emma felt a fierce protectiveness rise in her chest. You didn't fail. Scout came back. That means something. That means he remembered what you built, what you gave him. Helen looked at her with eyes that held decades of accumulated sadness. A single horse making it back doesn't undo the others I lost. Doesn't bring back the children who needed what we offered. Maybe not, Emma said, but it's a start. Grace had been unpacking medical supplies while they talked. She pulled out an 4 kit and held it up. Helen, I need to get fluids into you. You're dangerously dehydrated. This is going to require an 4 line. Do I have your permission? Helen nodded weakly. Do what you need to. As Grace worked to establish the 4, Emma explored the cabin more thoroughly. The shelves held mostly empty jars now, with just a few containing what looked like beans and preserved vegetables. A calendar on the wall was stopped at June 7 months ago. Beside it hung photographs, faded and curling at the edges, showing children on horseback, their faces split, with genuine smiles. In several photos, Emma recognized Scout, or Amber as she'd named him, carrying small riders with patient grace. One photograph showed Helen herself, probably 20 years younger, standing amid a group of horses and children, her arms spread wide as if to encompass them all. The joy in her face was unmistakable, the sense of purpose radiating from every line of her body. Emma felt a pang of loss for the woman Helen had been, for the life that had been dismantled by bureaucracy and budget cuts. She turned back to find Grace finishing with the 4, taping the line securely to Helen's arm. The bag of saline hung from a nail Grace had found in one of the roof beams, the clear liquid slowly dripping life back into the elderly woman's depleted system. We need to keep you warm and hydrated for at least a few hours before we can even think about moving you, Grace said. Emma, can you get a fire built up? There's not much wood left in here. Emma nodded and headed outside to gather more fuel. The temperature had dropped noticeably even in the short time they'd been inside the cabin. She worked quickly, breaking dead branches from the surrounding trees and carrying armloads back to stack near the stove. On her 3rd trip, she paused to call her father on the satellite phone. The connection was scratchy but functional. We found her, Emma said as soon as he answered. Helen Porter. She's alive but in bad shape. Grace is treating her now. The relief in David's voice was palpable. Thank God. What's your plan? Stay here tonight, let Grace stabilize her, then figure out how to get her down the mountain tomorrow. She can't walk, Dad. We're going to need help. I'll contact Ranger Cooper, get a rescue team organized. They can bring a litter and extra personnel. Her father paused. Emma, you did good. Really good. The praise warmed her more than any fire could. Thanks, Dad. I'll call again tonight with an update. After ending the call, Emma returned to the cabin with her arms full of wood. Inside, the atmosphere had shifted slightly. Helen was more alert now, the four fluids already making a visible difference. Grace had wrapped additional blankets around her and was coaxing her to eat small bites of an energy bar. Scout stood near the door, unwilling to leave but too large to comfortably fit entirely inside the cramped space. His eyes never left Helen, tracking her every movement with an attention that bordered on vigil. Emma fed wood into the stove, building up the fire until heat radiated through the small room. Then she settled onto the floor near Helen's chair, wrapping her own blanket around her shoulders against the cold that seemed to seep through every crack in the walls. Can you tell us what happened? She asked gently. How did Scout end up back here? Helen took a sip of water Grace offered before answering. I don't know all of it, but about 3 weeks ago, I heard horses outside. Thought I was hallucinating at first. When I looked out, there was Scout, standing in the meadow like he'd never left. He was thin, injured, exhausted, but he'd made it back. How long had it been since the program closed? Almost 9 years. Helen's voice held wonder. 9 years, and he still found his way home. Grace looked up from organizing her medical supplies. Horses have remarkable spatial memory and homing instincts, but 9 years is extraordinary. He must have been held somewhere relatively close, or the journey would have been impossible. There's a livestock auction about 70 miles south of here, Emma said slowly, piecing together possibilities. If the kill buyer sold him there, and someone local bought him for work or breeding, Scout could have escaped and used familiar landmarks to navigate back. He always was the smartest horse I ever trained, Helen said with a trace of pride. Used to watch him problem solve, opening gates the other horses couldn't figure out, navigating obstacles by thinking rather than just reacting. She looked at Scout with profound affection. I should have fought harder to keep them all. Should have refused to let them go. You did everything you could with the resources you had, Grace said firmly. The system failed those horses, not you. They sat in silence for a while, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the wind moving around the cabin's exterior. Emma found herself studying Helen's face, seeing past the weathering and age to the woman underneath, the one who had dedicated years to healing broken children through connection with equally broken horses. Did Scout help you at all these past weeks? Emma asked. After he came back? Helen smiled faintly. He stayed close, kept me warm some nights when the fire burned down too low. I think he knew I wasn't well. There were days I thought about just letting go, about closing my eyes and not opening them again. But every time I thought that, Scout would come to the window and whinny, like he was reminding me I couldn't quit yet. Emma felt tears prick her eyes. He went to find help. That's why he left you and came down to the valley. He was looking for someone who could save you when he couldn't do it alone. Grace nodded thoughtfully. Tracks with his behavior. The fixation on getting somewhere specific, the refusal to rest until he'd completed the journey. He had a mission, and it was bringing help back to you. Helen reached out to touch Scout's muzzle one more time, her fingers trembling with emotion or weakness or both. All those years ago, I trained him to be a therapy horse. Trained him to sense when someone needed help and to provide it. Never imagined he'd use those skills to save me. That's what good training does, Grace said. It doesn't just teach skills. Teaches purpose. As afternoon faded toward evening, Grace continued monitoring Helen's condition, while Emma prepared a basic meal from their supplies. The cabin's cramped quarters forced them into close proximity, but there was comfort in that. A sense of shared purpose that transcended the physical discomfort. Helen ate slowly, managing a few bites of soup and bread before exhaustion pulled her back toward sleep. Grace adjusted the foredrip and checked vital signs, her expression gradually relaxing as Helen's condition stabilized. She's not out of danger, but she's responding well to treatment," Grace told Emma in a low voice. "The biggest risk now is infection or complications we can't see. We need to get her to a hospital as soon as possible, but moving her tonight would be more dangerous than waiting for proper rescue equipment." Emma agreed, settling in for what promised to be a long night. She made another check-in call to her father, updating him on Helen's condition and confirming that a rescue team would be deployed at first light. Then she spread out her sleeping bag near the stove, positioned so she could keep watch over both Helen and the fire. Scout remained near the door, a silent guardian refusing to abandon his post. Emma found herself thinking about loyalty, about the bonds that could form between humans and animals, about the way love could persist across years and distance and impossible circumstances. As darkness closed in around the cabin, Emma lay awake listening to the wind and Helen's breathing and the occasional stamp of Scout's hooves. She thought about her own journey, about the decision to follow a mysterious horse into the wilderness, about the chain of small choices that had led them to this moment. Her mother would have loved this story, she realized, would have seen it as proof that courage and compassion could still matter in a world that often seemed to have no room for either. Emma sent a silent thought toward her mother's memory, a wordless thank you for the lessons that had prepared her to recognize when something mattered enough to fight for. Tomorrow the rescue team would come. Tomorrow Helen would begin the long process of recovery, of rejoining a world she had tried to leave behind. Tomorrow Emma would face the question of what came next, how to honor what Scout had accomplished, how to ensure that Helen's story didn't end in obscurity. But tonight, in this small cabin on a mountain where time moved differently, Emma simply kept watch. She fed the fire when it burned low. She checked on Helen when her breathing changed. She whispered quiet reassurance to Scout when he shifted restlessly in the doorway. And she understood, perhaps for the first time, that heroism wasn't always about grand gestures or dramatic rescues. Sometimes it was about showing up, about refusing to look away, about following through even when the outcome was uncertain. Scout had taught her that this horse who had crossed impossible distance to complete a promise made years ago. He had shown her what it meant to have a mission that mattered more than comfort or safety or rest. As Emma finally drifted toward sleep, her last conscious thought was a promise to herself and to Scout and to Helen. This wouldn't be the end of the story. Whatever came next, she would make sure that the bond between this woman and this horse, the work they had done together, the children they had healed, would not be forgotten. The wind howled around the cabin, testing its walls, searching for weaknesses. But inside, the fire burned steady. 3 women and a horse sharing warmth and purpose in the face of wilderness that cared nothing for their survival. And in that small circle of light and heat, something that had been broken for a very long time began, slowly and tentatively, to mend. Morning arrived with pale light filtering through the cabin's single window, turning the frost on the glass into patterns that looked like ferns and feathers. Emma stirred from an uneasy sleep, her body stiff from the hard floor and the cold that had crept in despite the fire she'd maintained through the night. She sat up slowly, checking first on Helen, who slept more peacefully than she had the evening before, her breathing deeper and more regular. Grace was already awake, crouched beside Helen's chair taking her pulse and checking the 4-line. She glanced at Emma and gave a small nod of approval. She made it through the night. That's a good sign. Her vitals are stronger than yesterday. Relief washed through Emma, loosening tension she hadn't realized she'd been holding in her shoulders and jaw. When will the rescue team arrive? Your father said they'd start at dawn. Given the terrain, probably another 3 or 4 hours. Grace stood, stretching carefully. We should prepare for their arrival. Get Helen as ready as possible for transport. Pack up anything she might need at the hospital. Emma nodded and began organizing, moving methodically through tasks that kept her hands busy while her mind wandered. She thought about Scout, who had spent the entire night in the doorway, never lying down, never truly resting. His dedication was absolute, as though he feared that if he let his guard drop for even a moment, Helen might slip away from him again. As Emma worked, Helen woke gradually, blinking against the morning light with confusion before memory oriented her. She looked immediately for Scout, relaxing only when she found him still there, still watching over her with those patient, knowing eyes. "How are you feeling?" Emma asked, kneeling beside the chair with a cup of warm tea made from supplies Grace had brought. "Like I've been put through a thresher," Helen admitted, accepting the cup with shaking hands. "But alive. More alive than I've felt in months." She sipped the tea carefully. "You said there's a rescue team coming?" Grace answered. "They'll transport you down the mountain to Riverside Hospital. You need proper medical care, tests to make sure there's no lasting damage from the exposure and malnutrition." Helen's expression clouded. "I don't have insurance anymore. Lost it when the program closed. Can't pay for a hospital." "We'll figure that out later," Emma said firmly. "Right now, the priority is getting you healthy. Everything else can wait." But Helen shook her head, a spark of the stubborn strength that must have sustained her through years of running a difficult program showing through her exhaustion. "I won't be a charity case. Won't be another burden on a system that's already stretched too thin." Grace sat down on the edge of the cot, her voice gentle but direct. "Helen, you spent decades helping children who had nowhere else to turn. You gave everything to that work until it broke you. Let someone help you for once. Let us help you." The words seemed to strike something deep in Helen. Her eyes filled with tears that spilled over, tracking down her weathered cheeks. "I don't know how to be helped. I only know how to be the one doing the helping." Emma felt a surge of recognition, understanding in that moment how alike Helen and her own father were. Both carrying guilt over losses they couldn't prevent. Both withdrawing from the world rather than risk further pain. Both needing to learn that accepting help wasn't weakness but another form of courage. "Then maybe it's time to learn," Emma said softly. "Scout came back to you after 9 years because you mattered to him. The children you helped, they mattered. The work you did mattered. You don't get to decide that your life has no value just because the program ended." Helen looked at her for a long moment, searching Emma's face as though trying to determine if she could trust these words from a stranger barely more than a girl. Finally, she nodded, a small surrender that seemed to cost her more than it should. "All right, I'll go to the hospital. I'll let you help." But she paused, looking at Scout with an expression of profound worry. What happens to him? The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. Scout had completed his mission, had brought help back to the woman who needed it. But what came next for a horse who had sacrificed so much to fulfill a promise made years ago? "He comes with us," Emma said, the decision forming even as she spoke the words. "Back to our farm. We'll make sure he's cared for properly, that he has everything he needs." Grace raised an eyebrow. "Emma, that's a big commitment. Your father is already struggling financially." "I know, but we'll figure it out." Emma looked at Scout, at the scars on his shoulder and the lean frame that spoke of hard traveling and harder years. "He deserves better than to be abandoned again. And besides," she smiled slightly, "I think we might need him as much as he needed us." Helen's expression softened, something like hope flickering in her tired eyes. "You'd do that? Take on the responsibility of caring for him even though he's not young anymore, even though he'll never be a working horse again?" "He already is a working horse," Emma said. "He's just doing different work than most people recognize. He's teaching us about loyalty and purpose and seeing things through even when it's hard. That seems like important work to me." The sound of voices and equipment echoed faintly from outside, growing louder as the rescue team approached through the meadow. Grace stood and moved to the door, waving to get their attention. Within minutes, the small cabin was filled with rangers and emergency medical personnel, their presence transforming the intimate space into something more clinical, more focused on logistics and protocols. Ranger James Cooper was among them, his weathered face breaking into a rare smile when he saw Helen alive and conscious. "Helen Porter, people have been wondering what happened to you for years." "I've been right here," Helen said with a trace of her old spirit. "Just didn't feel like answering when people came calling." The EMTs worked efficiently, replacing Grace's makeshift four with their professional equipment, checking vital signs, asking questions about symptoms and medical history. They brought a litter designed to carry patients over rough terrain and began the careful process of transferring Helen from the chair. Scout became agitated at this disruption, pushing further into the cabin despite the crowded conditions, trying to position himself between Helen and the strangers. Emma quickly moved to his side, gripping his halter and speaking in low, calming tones. "It's okay, boy. They're helping her. You did your job. You brought us here, and now she's going to be safe." Scout's ears flicked back toward Emma's voice, but his eyes remained locked on Helen. The elderly woman reached out from the litter, her hand extending toward the horse in a gesture of reassurance. "I'll be all right, Scout. Thanks to you, I'll be all right." Her voice cracked. "You were always the bravest one. Always the one who refused to give up." The EMTs secured Helen in the litter and began the careful journey out of the cabin. Scout tried to follow, but the narrow doorway and the team of people made it impossible. He whinnied, a sound of distress that Emma had never heard from him before, high and urgent and desperate. Helen turned her head as much as the restraints allowed. "Take care of him, please. He deserves everything good." "I will," Emma promised. "I swear it." They watched as the rescue team carried Helen across the meadow and up the trail that would eventually lead down to the valley and proper medical care. Scout strained against Emma's hold, every muscle taut with the desire to follow, to continue protecting the person he had traveled so far to save. Only when Helen had disappeared from sight did Scout finally still, his head dropping in what looked like exhaustion or defeat, or perhaps simply the recognition that his mission was truly complete. Emma felt tears on her face and didn't bother to wipe them away. Grace put a hand on her shoulder. "We should secure the cabin and start heading down ourselves. The weather's going to turn by tonight." They spent the next hour making the cabin as weatherproof as possible, banking the fire and closing shutters, leaving it ready for Helen's eventual return if she chose to come back. Emma found herself hoping she would, that whatever healing happened in the valley would eventually bring Helen full circle to this place that had been her refuge and her prison. The journey down the mountain was slower than the ascent had been. Scout moved with visible reluctance, frequently stopping to look back toward the cabin, toward the place where he had finally found what he'd been searching for. Emma understood the feeling. Sometimes completing a mission left you adrift, uncertain of what came next when the driving purpose that had sustained you was suddenly gone. They made it down to the tree line by early afternoon, stopping to rest and water the horses at the same creek where they'd camped on the way up. Emma called her father again, updating him on their progress and Helen's evacuation. "The whole valley's talking about it," David said, his voice carrying a warmth Emma hadn't heard in years. "Helen Porter found alive after all this time. That horse that led you to her. You're a bit of a hero, Emma." The word made her uncomfortable. "I'm not a hero. Scout is the hero. I just followed him. Sometimes following is the bravest thing you can do." Her father paused. "I've been thinking about what you said, about having a real conversation when you got back. I'm ready for that now. Ready to talk about the farm, about the future, about all the things we've been avoiding." Emma felt warmth bloom in her chest, hope mixed with relief. "Good, because I have some ideas." They reached the farm as evening was settling over the valley, the apple orchards casting long shadows across fields that needed harvesting before frost came. David was waiting at the barn, and to Emma's surprise, so were several neighbors including Grace's husband and the Sanders family and old Frank who had been there the day Scout first arrived. Her father stepped forward as Emma dismounted, his eyes going to Scout with an expression that was hard to read. "So this is the horse that started all of this?" Emma nodded, suddenly protective. "His name is Scout. Or Amber. I've been calling him both." She took a breath. "Dad, I told Helen we'd keep him. I know we're barely making ends meet, but I couldn't leave him with nowhere to go. Not after everything he's done." She braced for argument, for the practical objections she knew her father had every right to make. Instead, David walked slowly to Scout, studying him with the eye of someone who had spent his whole life around animals and land and hard choices. "He's got good bone structure, strong shoulders. Eyes are clear and intelligent." David reached out carefully, letting Scout catch his scent before touching him. "This is a horse that knows his purpose." He paused, his hand resting on Scout's neck. "I haven't been around horses since Thomas died. Couldn't stand to be near them, couldn't stand what they reminded me of." Emma waited, hardly breathing. But looking at this one, her father continued, I'm reminded of something different. He looked at Emma, really looked at her. I'm reminded that sometimes the thing you're most afraid of is exactly what you need to face. You were brave enough to follow this horse into the mountains. Maybe I can be brave enough to let him stay in our barn. The neighbors broke into spontaneous applause, and Emma felt tears streaming down her face as she hugged her father tightly. Thank you so much. Don't thank me yet, David said, but there was a hint of humor in his voice. You're in charge of all his care. Feeding, mucking, vet bills. This is your responsibility. I know. I want it to be. Frank stepped forward, clearing his throat awkwardly. We've been talking, those of us who remember Helen's program, about what she did for kids who were falling through the cracks. Seems a shame to let that work die just because the state gave up on funding it. What are you saying? Emma asked. We're saying maybe it's time to bring something like that back. Not exactly the same, but similar. Frank gestured to the others. The Sanders have that old barn they're not using. Grace has the veterinary knowledge. Your dad's got land and an understanding of what it takes to run a program. And you've got a therapy horse that proved he's still got plenty of work left in him. Emma's mind raced, possibilities unfolding faster than she could process them. You mean start a new program? Here? Why not? Grace had dismounted and joined the conversation. The need hasn't gone away just because the funding did. If anything, there are more kids who need what horses can teach them than there were when Helen started her program. David held up a hand. Hold on. This is a lot to take on. We're talking about liability, insurance, training, permits. It's not something you just decide on a Tuesday evening. But you're not saying no, Emma observed, watching her father's face. He smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes for the first time in years. No, I'm not saying no. I'm saying let's be smart about it. Let's talk to Helen when she's recovered enough. See if she'd be willing to consult. Let's reach out to the organizations that work with foster kids and trauma survivors. Let's do this right if we're going to do it at all. The group talked late into the evening, plans and ideas flowing freely, the excitement building as people who had felt helpless in the face of struggling farms and disappearing community began to see a way forward. Emma listened and contributed, but mostly she watched Scout, who had found a spot near the barn where he could see the mountains and the valley simultaneously. Later that night, after everyone had gone home and David had retired to the house, Emma brought Scout a bucket of warm mash and an armload of fresh hay. She sat beside him in the stall, her back against the wall, watching him eat with better appetite than he'd shown since arriving. You did it, she told him quietly. You saved her. You brought people together. You reminded us all that some things are worth fighting for even when the odds are impossible. Scout paused in his eating, turning to look at her with those dark, intelligent eyes. Emma reached up to stroke his face, feeling the coarse hair and the warmth of living muscle and bone. Helen's going to recover. The doctor said she'll need time, but she's going to be okay. And maybe, if we do this right, you'll get to do the work you were trained for again. Help kids who need exactly what you have to offer. She thought about the children in the photographs she'd seen in Helen's cabin, their faces transformed by connection with horses who gave them safety and purpose. She thought about her own journey, about the girl who had stood between a horse and a rifle, who had chosen to follow when everyone else had looked away. Emma thought about her mother, who had believed in doing the work that needed doing simply because it needed doing. About her Uncle Thomas, who had died trying to save animals that couldn't save themselves. About her father, learning to face the thing he feared most because his daughter had shown him it was possible. And she thought about Scout, this remarkable horse who had carried a promise across years and miles and pain, who had refused to quit until he'd seen his mission through to completion. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human drama, indifferent to small acts of courage that changed individual lives without altering the fundamental nature of the universe. But Emma understood now that those small acts were enough, that showing up mattered, that loyalty mattered, that seeing things through to their conclusion, even when you couldn't see the end from the beginning, mattered more than comfort or safety or the reasonable objections that kept most people from trying. She stayed with Scout until he finished eating and began to show signs of sleep, his head dropping, his weight shifting as exhaustion finally claimed him. Then she stood carefully, gave him one last pat, and headed toward the house where her father had left the porch light burning for her. Tomorrow they would start making concrete plans. Tomorrow Helen would continue her recovery in a hospital room, probably arguing with every doctor about unnecessary procedures and excessive costs. Tomorrow the valley would wake up to news of the found woman and the horse who had saved her, and people would talk about it over coffee and morning chores, the story growing in the telling. But tonight, Emma simply climbed the stairs to her childhood room, past the photographs of people she had loved and lost, past the glow-in-the-dark stars that her mother had helped her place. She fell into bed fully clothed, too exhausted even to pull off her boots, and slept without dreams, the deep sleep of someone who had completed something important. The seasons turned. Helen recovered slowly but steadily, the hospital stay stretching into weeks as doctors addressed the various deficiencies and complications that came from months of inadequate nutrition and care. Emma visited her regularly, bringing news of Scout and updates on the program they were building. By winter, Helen was strong enough to leave the hospital, though the doctors had forbidden her return to the mountain cabin. Instead, she moved into a small apartment in town, close enough to the Hartley farm that she could visit Scout and consult on the program that was taking shape. The Hartley Porter Equine Therapy Initiative, they called it, acknowledging both Helen's legacy and the family who had made its resurrection possible. David had thrown himself into the project with an energy Emma hadn't seen in him since before her mother's death, as though caring for something beyond their immediate survival gave him permission to hope again. They started small, with just 3 children referred by the state foster care system, 3 kids who had been labeled difficult or damaged or beyond help. Helen worked with Emma to teach her the fundamentals of therapeutic riding, the patience and intuition required to match child with horse, to create the conditions where healing could occur. Scout was magnificent. Despite his age and the hardships he'd endured, he approached the work with the same dedication he had shown in finding Helen. Emma watched him carry a 7-year-old girl who hadn't spoken in 6 months, saw the moment when the child's hands relaxed on the saddle horn, when her body melted into trust. She watched him stand perfectly still while a 10-year-old boy with reactive attachment disorder raged and cried and finally collapsed against Scout's shoulder, sobbing out years of accumulated pain. The horse seemed to understand that this was what he had survived for, that all the miles and all the suffering had led to these moments when his presence could transform trauma into healing. Spring arrived with the kind of gentle warmth that made the valley glow green and gold. The apple trees bloomed in clouds of white and pink, and David actually laughed one morning at breakfast, a sound so unexpected that Emma froze with her coffee cup halfway to her lips. "What?" her father asked, noticing her expression. "Nothing," Emma smiled. "Just good to hear you laugh again." The program grew steadily. More children were referred. More volunteers stepped forward. Grace donated veterinary services. The Sanders family converted their barn into a proper indoor arena. Fundraising events brought in enough money to cover basic operations, and David managed to negotiate a grant from the state that provided some financial stability. By summer, they were serving 15 children regularly, and there was a waiting list. Helen had trained 2 other horses from the farm to work in the program, though everyone acknowledged that Scout remained special, the one who seemed to have an almost supernatural ability to read what each child needed. One evening in late summer, Emma and Helen stood by the paddock fence watching Scout graze peacefully in the golden light. The horse looked healthier than he had in months, his coat glossy, his frame filled out with good feed and regular care. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Scout hadn't found his way back to you?" Emma asked. Helen was quiet for a moment. "Every day. If he hadn't made that journey, I would have died in that cabin. The work we're doing now wouldn't exist. Those children we've helped would still be struggling without the support they needed." She turned to Emma. One horse changed everything. One stubborn, loyal horse who refused to forget. Emma thought about the morning Scout had appeared at their fence, injured and determined. She thought about standing between him and her father's rifle, about the choice to follow when everyone else would have looked away, about the chain of small decisions that had led to this moment, to children laughing in the arena, to her father's transformation, to Helen's second chance at the work she loved. I'm glad I followed him, Emma said simply. So am I. Helen's hand found Emma's shoulder, squeezed gently. You saved my life by following him. But I think maybe he saved yours too. Gave you something to care about beyond just surviving. Emma nodded, recognizing the truth in those words. She had been drifting before Scout arrived, going through the motions of life without real engagement or purpose. The horse had given her a mission, and that mission had opened up possibilities she had never imagined. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple and deep blue, Emma felt a completeness she hadn't known was possible. Not perfection. The farm still struggled financially, the program faced constant challenges, and her father still carried scars that would never fully heal. But completeness nonetheless, the sense that she was exactly where she needed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. Scout lifted his head from grazing, looking toward Emma and Helen with those knowing eyes. Emma raised a hand in acknowledgement, a gesture of gratitude and recognition. The horse had taught her about courage and commitment, about seeing things through even when the path was unclear, about the importance of showing up for the things and people that mattered. She understood now why her mother had believed in doing the work that needed doing, why her uncle had died trying to save animals that needed saving, why her father had kept the farm going despite impossible odds. They had all understood something essential about purpose, about the way life gained meaning through dedication to something beyond yourself. Scout had made that same choice when he escaped whatever place had held him for 9 years and began the long journey back to Helen. He had chosen loyalty over comfort, mission over safety, commitment over self-preservation. And in making that choice, he had not only saved Helen's life but had created ripples that spread outward, touching Emma and her father and Grace and the children who now came to the farm carrying their own wounds and leaving with something resembling hope. As full darkness settled over the valley, Emma headed back to the house, leaving Scout to his grazing and Helen to her quiet contemplation. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new children to help, new obstacles to overcome. But tonight she simply felt grateful, for horses who kept promises, for elderly women who built their lives around healing, for fathers who learned to love again, and for her own stubborn willingness to follow a mystery into the mountains. The porch light burned steady as she climbed the steps, and through the kitchen window she could see her father preparing dinner, moving with more ease than he had in years. Emma paused at the door, taking in the moment, storing it away as the kind of memory that would sustain her through harder times to come. Then she went inside to join him, ready to talk about tomorrow's plans, about the children scheduled to come, about the future they were building together one careful step at a time. A future that had become possible because a girl had refused to let them destroy an injured horse, and that horse had refused to abandon the woman who had once given him purpose. Some stories ended with grand gestures and dramatic resolutions. This one ended with dinner being served, with horses safe in their stalls, with children sleeping more peacefully than they had in months, with broken people learning to be whole again through the simple act of showing up and trying. And that, Emma thought as she helped her father set the table, was more than enough. 2 years passed like water flowing through Willow Creek, constant and transforming. The Hartley Porter Equine Therapy Initiative had grown beyond anything Emma imagined that cold morning when she first saw Scout at the fence. The program now served 40 children each season, with a staff of trained volunteers and 3 full-time instructors including Emma herself, who had deferred college to pour her energy into the work that had claimed her heart. Helen had become the program's director, her weathered hands still braiding leather markers for the therapy horses, her voice still carrying authority when she trained new volunteers in the subtle art of reading both horse and child. She lived in a cottage on the Hartley property now, close enough to the barn that she could visit Scout every morning before the children arrived. The horse himself had become something of a legend in the valley. Parents brought their struggling children specifically requesting Scout, having heard stories of his remarkable ability to calm the most traumatized kids. He was older now, moving with the careful deliberation of advancing years, but his eyes remained clear and knowing, his patience inexhaustible. David Hartley had transformed alongside his farm. The apple orchards still produced their harvest each fall, but the land had taken on new purpose. He had converted the southern pasture into riding trails, built a covered arena for winter sessions, and established a scholarship fund that ensured no child was turned away for inability to pay. The grief he carried for his brother Thomas had softened into something more bearable, transmuted through the work of helping others heal. Emma stood in the arena one October afternoon, watching a 12-year-old boy named Marcus take his first ride on Scout. The child had been through 4 foster placements in 2 years, had stopped speaking to adults entirely, had been written off by most of the social workers assigned to his case. But something in Scout's steady presence had caught his attention during the orientation session. Now Marcus sat astride the old horse, his small hands gripping the saddle horn while Scout walked in slow, measured circles around the arena. Emma walked alongside, one hand resting lightly on Scout's shoulder, ready to intervene if needed but trusting the horse to know what he was doing. After the 3rd lap, Marcus's rigid posture began to soften. His death grip on the saddle loosened slightly. And then, so quietly Emma almost missed it, he whispered, "Good horse." The words hung in the air, precious beyond measure. Helen, observing from the rail, met Emma's eyes and nodded once. This was why they did this work. For these small breakthroughs, these tentative steps toward healing. That evening, Emma walked out to the paddock where Scout stood watching the mountains, his familiar vigil maintained even after all this time. She brought him an apple from the harvest, holding it flat on her palm while he took it with gentle lips. "You did good today," she told him, running her hand along his neck. "Marcus actually talked. That's because of you." Scout chewed the apple thoughtfully, then returned his gaze to Cascade Ridge, where the peaks were turning pink in the sunset. Emma wondered if he thought about Helen's old cabin, about the journey he'd made to save her, about the life that had unfolded because he refused to give up. She thought about her own journey, about the girl who had stood between this horse and a bullet, who had chosen to follow into unknown territory because something in her recognized that Scout's mission mattered. That girl felt both distant and present, transformed but still fundamentally herself. From the barn, she heard children's laughter as the evening feeding session wrapped up. Helen's voice rose above the noise, patient and firm, teaching responsibility through the care of animals who had once needed saving and now did the saving themselves. Emma leaned against Scout's warm shoulder, breathing in the familiar smell of horse and hay and autumn. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new children carrying their invisible wounds, new opportunities to transform pain into purpose. But tonight, standing beside a horse who had taught her everything about courage and commitment, Emma simply felt grateful for second chances, for stubborn loyalty, for the healing that became possible when broken things refused to stay broken. Scout stamped once, then lowered his head to graze, at peace with the life his journey had created. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.